Welcome back to Let's Talk Agri-Tech, where we explore the role of innovation and technology in the future of farming. This mini-series is built around the insights from our latest report, Innovation and Technology, the Farmer's Perspective. The report captures the views of farmers on what they need from agri-tech, the barriers to adoption, and how we can co-develop better solutions. Over the course of this podcast series, we've been speaking with experts and industry leaders to unpack these themes in more detail. And today, we're focusing on knowledge exchange, how farmers learn, share information, and adopt new practices. We're joined by Sarah Nightingale, Knowledge Exchange Manager at the UK Agri-Tech Centre, to explore what effective knowledge exchange looks like, why trust and peer-to-peer learning are so important, and how we can improve the way farmers access reliable, practical information. Sarah, could you please just briefly introduce yourself, a bit about your background, particularly around farming and knowledge exchange and all of the exciting things we've been talking about in here, and then obviously your involvement in this particular piece of work.
So my passion is making sure that innovations are fit and functional for the farming community. I was born into farming and never left. I think that's kind of a nice way to summarise it. Animal scientist, and then went into industry really. So I've got a lot of professional experience within the industry, talking to farmers, understanding farmers. I think that's really key to that knowledge exchange function, understanding what's going down on the ground and what are the pressures within the industry, and using that to connect the two is really, really important.
Yeah, and then I think just to give some background on your involvement in this project, probably a good 8 months ago, Sophia and I got back some results from a survey of 120 odd farmers, and some interesting stuff came back from that, and around their thoughts on technology and innovation and their need for real world practical solutions. And we sensed there was something in there around a desire to collaborate. And it was at that point we brought you and a few other people in the organisation in to look at that and to have some internal workshops thinking about what can we do to build on this. Do you want to just talk a little bit about how and what it was about those early results that made you realise that knowledge exchange was going to be such a fundamental part of kind of the outputs of this?
Yeah, so I think unlike other industries that rely heavily on formal education and quite often digital learning, farmers often learn through experience, and that's really key here. They learn through observations, peer interactions, and one of the most effective ways that farmers learn is exchanging knowledge with their peers. They tend to trust advice from fellow farmers who've faced similar situations.
Why do you think knowledge exchange is such a critical piece for this innovation and technology adoption puzzle?
So knowledge exchange, it's fundamental really because it unlocks what motivates the industry and what motivates the farming community, or why the farming community may object to the adoption of innovations. So the process of this knowledge exchange, this engagement with the farming community, this bringing them on the journey is really vital. Ultimately, because it doesn't make sense to create something that doesn't work in a real world practical environment. But by applying a strategic approach to knowledge exchange, it helps ensure that those outputs meet user expectations and, most importantly, the functionality on the ground, on the farm, and the messaging is fit for the industry as well. Knowledge exchange is so much more important than just disseminating what a product does, or in our case, the outputs of a project at the end of the project. It's so much more than that. It requires bringing farmers on that journey as a fundamental part of that development process.
There you talked about on-farm demos and trials. Obviously, something we do as an organisation is farm walks to try and incorporate a lot of that. Why do you think those particular methods of knowledge exchange are so powerful?
Yeah, so it's hands-on experience. That's crucial. Classroom-based training lacks that practical, on-the-ground experience that farmers rely on. Quite often, concepts that work in theory are not, or they don't often translate well in that real-world farm those real world farm conditions. On-farm demos provide that valuable learning opportunity, direct engagement with experts, trusted advisors, as well as providing that strong social aspect as well, which is highly valued across the whole agricultural landscape. But fundamentally, farmers like to learn from their peers. They like to understand what's worked for them. There's a social and an emotional aspect.
Can I pick up on something you mentioned there, which was trust, and something which you really pushed for us to introduce into the workshops was these questions around, when speaking to farmers, around who are your trusted advisors, and some of the insights that came out of that were really helpful.
Yeah.
But do you want to talk more broadly about why trust is so important, particularly for farmers, and who they trust and why they trust them?
Yeah, so we need to know who farmers value. We need to know what their emotional response is to particular challenges as well. We need to know who those trusted advisors are, and they vary across the industry and through the different demographics within each sector. Now, that trusted advisor may be the service engineer or the livestock auctioneer or their local discussion group. But it's not necessarily the academics or the researchers. Those trusted advisors are quite often integrated into that on the ground. They're responding to quite pressured situations, through breakdowns or when commodity prices fall, or and that's where that really nice relationship between the farmer and their trusted advisor. It may be their neighbour. It may be somebody who's implemented something that has worked.
One of the things I found really interesting when we were having a lot of these conversations with farmers is on something like the transition to more sustainable farming practices, and where we're asking farmers to maybe stop buying fertilizer or pesticides, etc. Something which doesn't get acknowledged, and I think is fairly unusual, is that, especially within small communities, those people, the agronomist or like dealers, may well be also part of that farmer or those farmers' quite tight social circle and a really big part of their lives. And so you're not just asking them to make a change, a transitionary change to their purchasing patterns for the business. You're asking them to make significant changes to their whole kind of social life and how they operate as a person. And that's fascinating to me. And I think it's something which doesn't necessarily always get considered when you're looking at this from the perspective of innovation and technology more esoterically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just down to that, seeing the technologies or seeing solutions in action and endorsed by others can just boost that confidence. And it just gets that, when you think about the autopilot process, beliefs are endorsed by experiences. By seeing new solutions working in action, it enables that I almost venture into that vulnerable stage phase, that like breaking out of that autopilot cycle and actually thinking, this is a credible solution. This could work for me. And without those farmer demonstrations, endorsement, you're really limited.
This amazing workshop that we held at Shimpling Park, and it was really nice to see you in action, to doing what you do best, like this kind of knowledge exchange, bringing farmers and people from industry together. And something that really stood out for me is the exercise that you did about pinch points when it comes to adopting technology, and how a lot of the farmers in that room were quite passionate about sharing what they want from technology. So my question really would be, how important is it for us to bring industry and farmers together in a room, and how do we do that effectively?
Farmers ultimately are the most important people to get in the room when developing farm innovations. Practical insights and how innovations might positively or even negatively impact day-to-day operations is vital, and it gives an opportunity to really address that before it becomes a commercial product. But we need to understand what those stressors and motivators are. We need to understand what farmers potentially object to. And it's really important that we address those through this knowledge exchange function, through the development of innovations. It's almost as important as developing the technology or the solution itself. If those objections aren't countered or aren't addressed, then it will always be difficult to integrate. It's being able to, open up mindset, change behaviors, change beliefs, and it is super important that the researchers, the innovators, your trusted advisors are all part of that.
Time is one of the most precious commodities for farmers, right? So how do we make it worth their time to bring them into those rooms and co-develop innovation and technology with us? Would you be able to talk to me a little bit about what you think those key touch points are when it comes to that innovation and technology development?
I think when we talked about touch points, I think we were talking about whether it's a WhatsApp group, online webinars, a farm demo day, us officially setting up workshops and open innovation days between academics, tech developers, and farmers. So there are all these different points at which we can try and capture this busy time of the farming community and use them to try and work out what the problems and potential solutions are, but then also work closely with academics and with the rest of the R&D community to try and sort of come up with solutions.
In terms of what works, face-to-face learning, ultimately. Industry events remain a key communication method. They provide valuable learning opportunities, direct engagement with experts, and most importantly, it's a strong social aspect, which is highly valued in the agricultural industry. Now, peer-to-peer learning is essential for farmers to trust. Farmers place trust in other farmers and those trusted advisors. Seeing those solutions in action can boost confidence in new approaches. It's also crucial for developing that kind of insights into credible messaging as well. However, digital tools can work, particularly in time-strapped sectors. So online platforms, magazines, website, video channels, social media, quite often the most valued tools due to their convenience and the wealth of accessible information. But it's really important that those credible messages are filtered into those digital communication methods as well. So both of them are hand in hand. In order to get that curiosity, you've got your digital method. In order to get your engagement and your really key insights, that peer-to-peer learning really is valuable.
Within the report, we've obviously pulled out a few case studies of what we think is some good farmer-led innovation that's involved strong knowledge exchange. If you were coming to this podcast and report as a PhD student with a bright idea or a tech developer, and you wanted to engage with farmers to try and stress test the idea or to further develop these ideas in the way that we've talked about in co-development, in your experience, and I think you're really well positioned to talk about this, what does good look like?
It depends on the sector. That's key. I suppose an understanding of each sector, the understanding of the demographics through the sectors and those challenges is really important. You've got to be mindful of that. And then from there, understanding where farmers, the valued touch points, the valued advisors, the valued methods of communication. And then from there, you can build up your workshops, your demonstrations. Farmers like to work to learn in a practical environment, and provided it means something to them. I think that's really important. It's tailoring that message in order to get that good response. If you're able to pull on that kind of emotional element, what are the core values? That's what gets the interest level. And it's absolutely fundamental that that's done at the start of innovations.
And to build on that, obviously you and I have been involved in the kind of newly announced Adopt
Yeah.
program via the support hub. And within that, there's an acknowledgement that there's, as you've just pointed out, lots and lots of different farm types, farming sectors. And I think there's an appreciation that we, as the UK Agri-Tech Centre, aren't necessarily well positioned to be doing all of the messaging and all of the outreach. And actually, it's about engaging with specific specialist groups within that. And I get a sense from the way you're describing co-development and knowledge exchange, it's a similar thing. If you're a tech developer, it's about engaging with the groups and with the specialists within that.
That's it. So, yeah, the fundamental element of the co-innovation isn't just about the practicalities of the technology or how it will be applied in, those real world settings, those on-farm settings. It's about interrogating that emotional response and the core values within those sectors. And a fundamental part of that is looking at those. I think the first step is countering those objections within the industry, filtering that through to the development of those technologies. And that's preparing for that outward facing communication that can then be used, within the wider community. It's endorsed, it's filtered through other channels.
You talk a lot about values and that emotional pull. And, one of the questions that we asked in our survey was what's exciting to farmers. You're from a farming background, right? So with your farmer's hat on, I'd love to know, what are
Yeah.
you excited about? What do you think is out there that would really have that emotional pull for you?
I think it's things that improve that productivity, profitability. It's down to return on investment. If something's going to be more difficult or something's not going to get that return on investment, then I don't have any emotional ties to it. It's about increasing resilience, making our farming business both kind of as the individual farm businesses resilient, but also British agriculture as a whole.
I know in your role as knowledge exchange manager at Agri-Tech Centre, you're really responsible for a lot of that knowledge exchange for a lot of our projects and, sharing what we've learned and disseminating that. As someone who's got a lot of experience in this, what do you think are the most effective ways that we can do that as an industry to farmers?
It's interrogating the industry to understand those stressors, those motivators for each and every sector, looking at the commercial motivations, structural, logistical, institutional, even psychological influences, and that provide learnings to ensure the most effective ways to drive change, adoption. It provides a basis for improving that productivity, sustainability. That's all really important. That's kind of your first step before we even go out to demonstrations.
Sarah, at this point, it'd be great if you could just give us a couple of examples of really interesting projects that you've worked on that exhibit this kind of knowledge exchange that we've been discussing.
Breed for Change, where we have integrated this applied knowledge exchange strategy. That's all about changing behavior. So in order to breed low methane sheep, you need some sort of mechanism to showcase that low methane capability. And that's through breeding values. Now, traditionally, breeding values have been quite a challenge within the industry. Farmers prefer quite a lot of visual methods, or, there's an element of, in some circumstances, mistrust. And that's down to kind of the different thought processes throughout the different demographics within the sheep industry. Now, part of that project is to set up the basis for changing behavior and changing mindset around those breeding values. So part of that is creating a followership for the project. It's about countering those objections, understanding those core values.
That's a really interesting one to understand the role of kind of behaviour change and values. For another example, could you tell us a bit about the Dancing for Daffodils project?
The Dancing with Daffodils project, that created, there was a lot of media coverage at the beginning of the project. So awareness within the industry, or there is awareness of the project within the industry. So then when we get to the next stages and, through the development of the project and even through to the end of the dissemination, we're able to bring people on because there's that element of curiosity to find out where we are, where we're going, and bringing those trusted advisors, bringing those farmers, bringing, everybody along on
Yeah,
the journey.
perfect.
And I think what I really like about that is it highlights this idea that we talked about in this process, but probably didn't include quite specifically in the report, which is this virtuous cycle. Because of course, like within the innovation, technology, R&D cycle, we've got ideation, where we obviously want to be working with farmers. We've got these projects where we actually develop these innovations and technologies. And then there's this knowledge exchange piece at the end. But actually what you and I have discussed is that knowledge exchange fits within all of those parts of the process, because there is, as you've just beautifully described, this virtuous cycle where if we have really exciting outputs and the farming community or specific areas of the farming community genuinely engage in that, then that will then encourage new entrants and new adopters and interest and excitement in innovation and technology. And that just carries around and around. And I think that's a really nice sort of way of looking at this.
Yeah, that's it. And it's not a linear process. It's you go back, you revisit, you're constantly in this cycle of addressing certain elements within, and that could be those values, or it could be those pressures. Agriculture is constantly changing, and the pressures within is the one industry that has to respond to absolutely every global catastrophe. And, there's a lot of resilience with that. But then, readdressing actually, where those stressors, where those motivators are, is really important. And I think that's often not acknowledged enough when developing new solutions, or, that kind of rechecking, going back into this cycle.
I absolutely love that. I think that's a really nice concluding point that addresses again that farmers work in a constantly changing environment. Do you have one big takeaway that you could give for both the kind of the research and tech development community when thinking about engaging in this space?
I think the biggest takeaway is farmers are integral to the design.
That wraps up today's discussion on knowledge exchange in farming. We've explored how farmers learn best, the role of trusted advisors, and why bringing farmers, researchers, and innovators together is the key to making new technology work in real-world conditions. Our full report, Innovation and Technology, The Farmer's Perspective, dives deeper into these themes, offering insights from farmers, case studies, and industry expertise. You can download it now to explore the findings in detail, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, make sure to check out the rest of this podcast series, where we'll be speaking with experts to further unpack these key topics. If you'd like to get involved, share your experiences, or learn more about how the UK Agri-Tech is supporting farmer-led innovation, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're a farmer looking to shape the future of research and technology, you can register for updates on the Adopt Fund via the support hub on FarmPep. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.